Hey, everybody. I want to tell you a little story about growing up as a Little League ball player in the middle of nowhere, Wisconsin, population 638. And when we would be in the ballpark, we were acutely aware that this thing existed in the middle of our town. Does anybody recognize what that might be? Anybody from the Midwest? It's a warning siren. Yeah, it's a tornado siren. And it stood on top of the firehouse, and every day at noon, it would go off in some sort of a test. And every day at noon, it would go off as a test, and we totally, completely ignored it. And it was sometimes euphemistically referred to as the noon whistle. And the idea behind that was it had to test, it happened every day at noon, and you basically went about your business there in the village park. But should storm clouds roll in and the siren go off, you've never seen prepubescent boys jump on a bike crying for their mommy and pedal as fast as we did. And I thought about it for a second, in retrospect. What made the difference between the sunny day where it was ignored and the cloudy day when it was invaluable, life-saving? And what I recognize is the product's the same. The product performs exactly as advertised, is exactly as specified. The product performs to, the tensile strength of the material, the decibel levels are exactly the same, but on one day it's completely ignored, the next day it's invaluable. And that was my first foray into what I like to call the decision-making sciences. So I study behavioral science, behavioral economics, social psychology, and neuroscience. I triangulate those into a concept called the decision science. In other words, the invisible forces that shape how humans make decisions, how they shape and frame value, and how they make choices. And then how you, as marketers and salespeople, construct your messages, content assets, and customer dialogues in a way to affect that. But I now can trace my interest in this all the way back to Little League and a concept called the context effect. When we get into the world of customer centricity, it's good to know why it works so that when you do build messages and content assets and campaigns and have conversations, you're doing it on purpose, not by accident. And science lesson number one, and I'm going to be totally honest, I went to J school for journalism, and I was hoping I would never have to do science and math again. Isn't that why we all got kind of into marketing? Now we're all scientists and mathematicians. It's crazy. But the context effect basically says that the reaction or perception of a stimulus, your product, your service, is affected by the environmental factors around it. In other words, the context your customer is in has a greater impact on the perception of your products and services than who they are and what your product is. So we were little leaguers in a ballpark in the middle of a village, and the product was the product and performed the same way in both ways. It was not until our context changed that we found that product useful. And it's the same way for you. So customer centricity, I'm going to go out on a limb, is less about who your customer is and more about the situation they're in. Another science lesson called fundamental attribution error. We tend to overestimate the disposition of our customers and underestimate the situation of our customers when you message. In other words, we're so wrapped up in titles and what their names are and all this stuff and personalization, and recognizing that the science says that's not what causes them to make a decision, who they are and what they do. And it's not your product or service, it's the situation they're in. And that's what I want to talk about today. The difference between the context of your prospects and the context of your customers and how that affects how you talk to them. Because it turns out it makes all the difference in the world for you to understand the psychology of your buyer in your efforts to be customer-centric. So I'm going to be really practical today. I'm going to be very practical today. I'm going to give you some frameworks on how to build messages based on the science of decision-making and the studies we do in this area with B2B buyers. What you need to know about the science of decision-making that's interesting is most of the stuff published in the academic journals by professors, Those studies have been performed on one of three audiences: grad students, convicts, or gamblers. Now, you might say, well, my customers are frequently 2 out of the 3, but the premise here is that B2B customers, do they react the same way as that audience? And so we do simulations and controlled field studies to look at what messages, what content assets, and what kinds of conversations actually generate the greatest impact. And I'm going to share those with you today so that you can leave practically improving the messaging, content, and conversations you have. So there's a little bit of theory, but very practical frameworks. Are you good with that? Is that fair exchange for your time? All right. So the first context that we really need to talk about is customer acquisition versus customer expansion. When you go out and try to acquire a new logo, generate demand in pipe, do you realize that you are really creating and driving only about 20 to 30% of the company's revenue and growth in a given year? That in fact, 70 to 80% of any growth in your company comes from expanding existing customers, keeping them and growing them. So this is important to realize where that is and recognize who you're messaging to with your content and your campaigns. Now, I'm going to ask a question, because here's what the question really boils down to. Do you take the same approach? So when you build a message, do you launch that message into the market to acquire new customers in the same way? Does it sound the same way, look the same way, smell the same way as when you're talking to your existing customers? By a show of hands, how many of you typically tend to use more or less, and we're all friends here, a one-size-fits-all approach to both of those? Hands up. So the rest of you take a dramatically different approach. Hands up if you do it for expansion. How many have no idea if your company does either of those? Probably if you're doing product-centric messaging, it doesn't matter, right? Because you're just talking about a product as if, it sells itself. Well, the idea here is that for many years what we've seen is a good 62% of the market we work with provides the same messaging in campaigns to new logos as they do to customers. And our research, spoiler alert, identifies that it has the exact opposite of intended effect. That if you use acquisition-oriented messages and you do it in the setting with your existing customers to renew and expand them, it can actually backfire on you. And some of you may be asking yourself, I didn't even know there was a difference between acquisition and customer expansion messages. Well, that's why we're here today. I'm going to talk about it, but I'm going to let you know why it's different. So first of all, I mentioned science, that I'm into the sciences, and the main piece of science after the context effect and after fundamental attribution error that I want to teach you is status quo bias. If you don't learn anything as a marketer or salesperson, I want you to learn status quo bias. The 4 reasons that I'm about to show you that people don't change their mind. Because if you're trying to get new logos and acquire new customers, you have to understand how to defeat, disrupt, and otherwise unhinge the status quo bias. But interestingly, when you are the status quo bias, you need to deliberately reinforce and defend that. We've got studies that will show you that if you go out with a disruptive message, you can dislodge an incumbent and win some business. If you use that same sort of provocative, disruptive message with your customers, you can actually create opportunities for your competitors. You open the door for them. Customers kind of shrug and go, if I got to change that much, why not look at everybody else? Because that's super new, and why should I assume you're best at it? That there's an actual science and psychology behind both of these. And I want to walk you through that as your takeaway today. Here's what it comes down to. It's not a buying journey, it's a deciding journey. Human beings make decisions. They don't buy, and they answer questions. This is not revolutionary, but you need to understand that the questions are different if you're a prospect versus if you are an existing customer. If you're a prospect, you're over here going, I'm pretty happy. It's not perfect. It's okay. Why should I change? Why should I do anything different? You look at your status quo and you're like, I'm pretty satisfied. This is pretty solid. Your job then as a marketer is to make them see the leaks and squeaks, right? The problems, the threats, the issues, the challenges, the risks involved with their current status quo. So they go, holy crap, can't stay here. I need to change. And then, why should I change now, not later? Why should I decide? Why should I defer? An existing customer is in a whole different place. They're answering the questions, why should I stay with these guys? Right? Why should I keep doing business with them? Have they continued to earn my business? And why should I do more with them? Why should I evolve? Why should I buy the next thing? Why should I upgrade? Why should I take that add-on? Literally, the psychology of your buyer is 180 degrees difference if they're an existing customer versus a prospect. Yet our messaging often takes the same tone, not realizing there are specific questions to be answered. And I want to give you a framework on each side of this to answer these questions. Not only then is it a different psychology, that means your story has to be different. It has to answer these different questions. And guess what? The skills to tell the story need to be different. So for the salespeople in the room, some days in the morning, you are a disruptor, right? You have 12% market share. We worked with a company that had a product that had 12% market share. So they built some advantages into the product and they wanted to go take some share. Well, in the morning, that salesperson had to be a disruptor. But that same salesperson in the afternoon, this is a medical technology company, was representing a product that had 80% market share. And they had to communicate a price increase and try not to lose any customers. So in the afternoon, they were a defender. Think about it. The message, it's a product. There's two products, and you look at those products, but they are entirely different in the way they must be messaged and the conversations that must happen. One must be disruptive to take share. One must be defending to protect share and get that price increase. And it turns out you need 180-degree opposite messages for that. So with that in mind, I want to teach you the 4 reasons people don't change their mind. So for you, when you're out there doing acquisition-related work, you know your message needs to disrupt these 4 things. It's also good to use for change management in your own operation. These 4 things are true of all humans who won't change their mind. We all live in status quo bias. So if you have to move a department in the direction that Debbie talked about, and you're trying to lead that, you might need to build a good why change message that disrupts status quo bias. If you're a parent, I'm the father of 4 daughters, and so women in revenue is a big deal to me. Currently costing me a lot of revenue, but that's a whole different story. But the idea of status quo bias here is that there's 4 reasons, and you need to know them, and this will work with your spouse, with your children, with your teams, and your customers. You're welcome. So the first reason people don't change their mind is preference stability. We make a decision, we establish a preference. And our goal is to keep that stable because humans dislike and hate uncertainty. So what they do is they make a decision, and how you hear this from your customers is when they use the word like. That sounds a lot like what I'm already doing. That seems a lot like what everybody else is doing. See, in Facebook land and everywhere else, like is good news. But in marketing land, the word like is actually your enemy. So you have to overcome preference stability. I'm going to talk about how you do that. But the second thing is that people perceive that the change that they got to make is where all the cost is. Oh, geez. I mean, this is basically operating now. But if I change, I've got to add additional costs. I got to probably find some budget. I've got to do some onboarding. I've got to do some change management. I got to do some interfaces. Oh, crap. It's going to cost me time, money, and stomach lining. It may not be perfect over here. I'm not dead yet, though. That project, that could kill me. That's the psychology of how the customer views change management. It's not perfect, but I'm not dead yet. That thing could kill me. The third reason people don't change their mind is selection difficulty. They believe that all companies are essentially providing the same, and they get overloaded with so much information that you look exactly the same. Even if you have something different, on the whole, you all look the same. And it just seems to be the same as everybody else. So you have to overcome that sameness. We'll talk about that in a second. Fourth and final reason people don't change is we as humans anticipate, project, and otherwise prophesy that we are going to regret and get all the blame if this thing doesn't go well. So these are the 4 reasons people don't change their mind in all walks of life, including your B2B buyer. They're still humans too. They don't check their brain at the door. Here's what you need to do. The story needs to recognize that persuasion is not possible without uncertainty. And you need to actually destabilize their current preferences. You have to help them see that what they think to be solid now is filled with holes, leaks, squeaks, problems, risks, challenges, missed opportunities, and other things that make this otherwise unsafe, unscalable, untenable, and otherwise unreliable. So you need to destabilize by telling them something they didn't already know about a problem or an opportunity they didn't even know they had. Second, you have to actually show them there's a cost to staying here. The science is very clear that people move away from loss and cost much faster than moving toward a gain. So the cost of change is real. You got to show the cost of staying the same is the same or greater than the cost of change. And your story must include that. Clear contrast. Human beings decide things in contrast. the number one tool our decision-making brain uses is there enough contrast between what I'm doing and what you're talking about? And the problem with contrast is it's a super visual sort of term. So like what the deal is, let's say this is what I'm doing today, and I perceive your offering to look like this. I will not make a change to get more or less the same. Why would I take on that risk, that cost, and everything else to get more or less the same? The perception of value lives in the contrast between their current state and the offered future state. And that is only seeable and respondable if you clearly show your story in contrast between current state and future state. Here's where I see value. No contrast, no value. Contrast, I now see value. Your stories must show current and future state differences clear enough to offer value. When people do product launches, they usually come out with their product and they have all their bits and their bytes and all the good news and all the USPs and all the distinctive features, and they're like Mighty Mouse. You know, your product launches and campaigns sound like, here I come to save the day. That was free. When I was in high school, I didn't play a lot of sports, as if you can't tell. I had the lead in my musical, and I was a straight A student, which really meant I didn't date much. But none of those guys are playing football, and I'm still on a stage singing, so. Anyways, I digress. So the premise here is that you must show clear contrast. The other one is you must have a great proof story, not just an after. You need a before and an after. Here's the problem with most proof stories that we see. You're telling them, here's the success that you can have. The problem is you're talking to a bunch of deniers. Prospects who work with other companies are in denial that they have a problem big enough to solve. Your proof stories have to start with the future, the current state, and describe what it looks like in companies like them and what you've seen so that they can identify and self-persuade that they might need to change because they feel and look the same way. Then they're going to care about how well you did it for someone else. Just coming out early with some ROI data has been shown to tamp down their interest and willingness because they're just not ready. They don't need ROI in your solution because they didn't even know they had a problem. So what I teach people in acquisition mode is that you must introduce unconsidered needs to destabilize their preferences, show the limitations, costs, loss to be avoided in their current state, and then show clear contrast with your recommended future state, and tell a great before and after story. Campaigns on the acquisition side where you're trying to take out an incumbent need to sound like this. Here's why. I will tell you that formula I just showed you, compared to other types of presentations and messages, outperforms it by creating a 50% higher perceived uniqueness and differentiation, which is really important. If you're trying to get people to do something new, they got to see you as at least different and unique. This gives you a 50% boost. It also created an 11% higher perception in being perceived as a higher quality partner than traditional messaging. I'm going to show what I mean by traditional messaging in a second. And a 10% higher likelihood of purchase. So you can literally increase the likelihood of purchase by double digits. The perception of you as a quality vendor, why is that important? Because if you're coming from the outside and trying to get in, you need to be seen as different, high quality, and become an optional choice that makes sense for them. So why does that work? I'm going to tell you what doesn't work so you see why this works. For 20 years, we've been told, go out and do voice of the customer research and do discovery and identify customer needs, map those needs to your capabilities, and build a story there. The idea was the more needs you could identify and map to the capabilities, the better your chances of having a value proposition or solution story. Well, 20 years ago, that might have been true, but now everybody does voice of the customer research and discovery. Everybody's being told by their customers the same exact business needs. You have more or less the same portfolio as your competitors, and you fell into the commodity trap. You unwittingly did exactly what you thought was right, and you're not understanding why the market says you seem the same, because that was so 20 years ago. So what people do when I've seen in a panic is they go, oh my goodness, we got to improve the story. We got to identify our unique selling propositions, our distinct capabilities that people don't know about, and shove them into the story and call them value-added services. You don't do that, but a lot of companies do. The premise of value-added services, unfortunately, conflicts with the psychology called choice overload, where people perceive them not as adding value, but adding cost and complexity. That's why you're so expensive. If you take a few of those things out, maybe we might be able to talk about this. And those are things I might not use, which could cause failure points for my organization. In an effort to distinguish yourself you actually produced a lower performing message than the red box. The ironies abound here. The real stories that win, the ones that had 50, 11, and 10, are the stories out here in the unconsidered needs, where it's an issue, a problem, a missed opportunity they didn't know they had that destabilizes their current preferences, and then it maps to something totally different than anything they've heard about and seeing to create the contrast. And in that story then is a perception of value that creates urgency for change, because these are problems I didn't see coming. And here's what you're thinking. I thought I was supposed to ask customers what their problems were and answer it. That's not why you're in business. The red box, that does not make you a trusted advisor. The red box just makes you a tape recorder. The green box makes you a trusted advisor, because it's the thing I don't know that I worry the most about as a customer. If you can tell me stories in there, and that's where the why change formula lives, right there in the green box. So I give that to you because it drives urgency for change and uniqueness from the current approach they're taking and the competitive set. So, defeating status quo bias has a very specific methodology. I'm going to offer an ebook at the end that has all these frames and all the research behind it, all free to you, so hang in there. So, defeating status quo bias. But the question was asked, what if we need to renew a customer? What if we are the status quo? Should we be disrupting with a why change message? Some call it provocation, some call it challenging, some call it insights, whatever you want to call it. Should we be doing that with our existing customers? And I will admit to you, 3 years ago, we went, sure, why not? But that didn't sit very well for a company like us that does our research. It turns out that when you are the status quo bias, you shouldn't disrupt the status quo bias. We thought that was revolutionary, and all the scientists that we work with at Stanford in the States and Warwick Business School were like, duh. Status quo bias has been proven for 40 years. I mean, this is not the shocker. They're like, here's our shocked face. And we're like, oh no, you don't understand. Our market is like all enraptured with provocation-based, insight, challenging types of why change messaging. And it turns out that in fact, you need to reinforce status quo bias. You need to reinforce preference stability. In fact, to make this point really come home, I feel like I got to move from the defeat status quo bias side of the stage to the reinforce status quo bias. And since we're in a Las Vegas-style hotel in the middle of a sketchy part of Boston, I'm going to do a magic trick a la David Copperfield. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Bam! So, what you see is, in fact, instead of destabilizing preferences, since you are the preference, you must deliberately reinforce those preferences, and I'll show you how. Instead of talking about the cost of staying the same, since you are the same, you need to lean into what the cost of change might be. And instead of selection difficulty, this is really interesting. Think about it. Our job as marketers and sellers is always to show this wide differentiation between us and competitors. Remember what I said earlier? People are loath to change if they think they're getting more or less the same. That in fact, when you are the incumbent, it might be to your best advantage not to talk about how different you are, not to talk about how new your stuff is, and not to surprise them with all this new crap at renewal time. Because in reality, they're more likely to stay if they think that you've just got their back and you're kind of keeping in pace with the advances in the market. Why would they change to get more or less the same? You following me? That is counterintuitive. Turns out it's true. And then finally, anticipated regret and blame. Nobody wants to stop positive momentum. So your job in talking to existing customers is to actually reinforce the biases that keep them to status quo, because you are the status quo. It's a game changer, and let's look at the study and the perception. So we tested something we called the Why Stay model, where we built a message framed on reinforcing status quo bias, and we tested it in many configurations to get a winning model, and then we put it up against the Why Change model. So we created a renewal scenario where a customer had been working with a vendor for 2 years, and they had accomplished some good things together. They didn't hit all their goals, but they hit some of their goals. And we tried a renewal message. The Why Change renewal message was all about the new stuff. And I don't know about your company, but a lot of companies at renewal time try to chuck all the new stuff into the renewal with the idea like, this is why they're going to renew with us, because we got all this new crap. And you lead with it, and you're like, this is great. You picked the right partner. Look at all this new stuff. So we did a why change story. And then over here, we took this formula, the winning why stay story, and we put them against each other in a controlled field trial. And what did we see? Turned out that why stay formula that reinforced all the elements of status quo bias defeated the why change approach. In fact, the customer had 10% higher favorability ratings toward the vendor when they heard the why stay version versus the why change version. So in fact, you thought they'd be more favorable towards you when you told them new things and gave them new ideas. It actually worked in the opposite direction. They were 13% more likely to renew when they heard the why stay formula as opposed to the why change. And we've been told this why change formula is designed to make customers feel like we're adding value because we're bringing all this fresh new insight. Well, that's maybe what they say, but what they do is what we really want to measure. And in these simulations and field trials, they actually were 13% more likely to renew when they heard a story framed like the why stay framework. 11% less likely to switch. We always ask the same question different ways to make sure it's consistent. Imagine that. Doing a message that seemed right to acquire customers going, well, if it's good for them, we should do something for our existing customers that sounds like that, and having it backfire, lowering your likelihood of renewal by 13% and increasing the likelihood of switching by 11%. The psychology goes like this. If it's all that new and all that different, and if I've got to change potentially that much anyways, why not just take a look at everybody so I make sure I'm doing it with the right vendor? You literally invite competition. Psychologically, existing customers, and you are status quo, you need to reinforce that bias there. So here's what's happening so you understand. At a high level, you're telling a story about, every study we did in this area opened by documenting the current results or impact you've had. If you can't do it for that specific customer because you don't have the data, you need to go out and survey the customers of that particular product line and create an estimated value and say, customers like you who are using this type of solution are generally having this kind of impact and seeing these kinds of results. And the other thing the story has to do is say, and customers like you have made these kinds of investments in getting to that level. They had to invest in this kind of change management, these process changes, these interfaces, but guess what? Those are sunk costs. You don't have to make those again. What is the subtle inference there when you tell that story? You're telling a story that I call your incumbent advantage. Incumbent advantage is real, and you have it as a vendor as well. In fact, it creates all kinds of risk when a new vendor comes in and is like, I've got this new thing. And they're like, hey, here's this new thing, new idea, potential value. And they're looking at it and going, yeah, there's some potential value there. But look at all the momentum we've got. Look at all the impact we've had. Look at all the investment we've made. Geez, we might have to do that again. I feel better about avoiding the risk associated with the losing out on the progress we've made and taking a step back, having to reinvest and find budget where we've already sunk that cost. And I feel a lot better about getting potential additional impact than I do about getting some new impact and sort of forgetting about all this progress we've made. The problem is if your message doesn't incorporate the story around the impact and the results and the investment that was made, they forget, they put you on the same par. Hey, here's a new story from my current vendor, here's a new story from a competitor, and they compare your new stories. That's not where you want them to be. Has anybody ever heard of the concept of the sunk cost fallacy? So another piece of science. The sunk cost fallacy, for those of you who haven't, have you ever picked up a book and got about a third of the way through it and you're like, this is shit? And then finish the book? Because you're like, well, if I've come this far, I mean, right? How many watched season 6 of Game of Thrones? You know what I'm talking about. This is crap. Well, I might as well finish it. So that's the idea of sunk cost fallacy. And it's real for humans. It may be a fallacy, but it's actually real. So they're like, holy cow, I've sunk all this cost. They don't remember that because over the years of your contract, decision makers have changed. And so you got to remind them. And then when you try to upsell them or upgrade them, you actually have to build on this idea that you've got momentum that nobody wants to step in front of. So at a very high level, I'm going to show you this. Because here's what we discovered. Brand new research in the area of upsells and add-on sales. Upsells and add-on sales are an interesting hybrid of why change and why stay. I don't have time to give you all the story behind it because I'm going to show you the ebook that you can get. But the idea is acquiring new customers, why change disrupts, renewing customers, moving them forward with you, why stay, defend, and then why evolve add-on sales, a hybrid of the two. And again, it outperformed the hybrid, outperformed the standalone why change. So before you go, if I have an existing customer but I want to sell them a new thing and go, do I use the why change story? No, you actually use that hybrid model. 10% more convincing case, 13% more willing to make the update and do the add-on, and 16% more likely to purchase your thing if you use that hybrid model where you use enough familiarity and existing customer relationship and impact to add the sales on, as opposed to coming in and pretending it's an all-new deal. Why not use your status quo bias, incumbent advantage to your advantage? Your messaging requires it. In a world where we are now being customer-centric, prospect, existing customer, the approaches are 180 degrees different. I know this to be true, and the stories need to be true, different, and the skills need to be different. And shameless plug, I've got a brand new book in January where we've done the renewal sale, we've done price increases studies, we've done upsell and add-on sales studies, and apologies. We have identified the most effective apology framework for achieving what we call service recovery paradox, meaning if you have a service problem and people don't like you, if you recover well, you can create more loyalty and advocacy than if you never had a service problem. So you're going to want to check that out. If you can't wait till January, here's the code I want you to take down right now. 3 free things at your disposal. Number 1, if you go to this code, or if you go to Giorgio in the back of the room, he's going to collect your cards in the middle. You have a chance to win a free private for your company webcast with me on all this. If you're like, shoot, I wish some of my colleagues were here, I'm going to give away 20 of these. So this is a pretty good probability in this room to 20 companies where I'll get on a webcast for an hour or so, talk about this, answer your questions. So enter to win that. You will be then put on the list for advance notice when the book comes out. But in the meantime, we've written an ebook called To Challenge or Not to Challenge, How to Handle Status Quo Bias, which will talk about all the research I've mentioned and give you the frameworks and give you the examples of the winning and losing messages. That is free for you today. So grab that picture, give a card to Giorgio in the center of the room, or meet me over at the expert bar because I'm going to hang around there till about noon today. All right? So, like a tornado siren, recognize that your product and your service isn't the hero of the story, that in fact it is the context that your customer is in that will drive the receptivity to your stimulus. Thank you very much.